Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that you have nowhere to go, no home, no country willing to take you, no passport that anyone recognizes, and the only place you are allowed to remain is an airport. For most people, an airport is somewhere you spend a few hours. For one man, it became his entire world, his bedroom, his dining room, his waiting room, and eventually, his home. His name was Mehran Karimi Nasseri, an Iranian man whose life would eventually become one of the strangest stories in modern aviation. But when he first arrived in Europe, he had no idea that an airport would become his home. He was trying to build a life outside Iran. He traveled through Europe carrying documents that would eventually become central to his future. And then, in 1988, everything changed. Nasseri's journey became tangled in international bureaucracy. His refugee and residency documents became central to his ability to travel. Without the necessary papers, crossing borders became increasingly difficult. What sounds like a simple administrative problem would become something much larger, a legal limbo, a situation where the question was no longer simply, "Where are you going?" It became, "Where do you legally belong?" Eventually, Nasseri ended up at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, and there was a strange loophole in his situation. He could remain in the airport's transit area, but he could not simply walk out and enter France like an ordinary passenger. So he waited. At first, he probably believed the situation would be temporary, a day, a week, maybe a few months. He had no reason to believe that 18 years were waiting for him. The first night was different from every night that came after it. He was still a traveler. His belongings were still luggage, the benches were still temporary, and every passenger around him had somewhere else to be. He didn't. As the terminal became quieter, Nasseri remained. The lights stayed on. The cleaning crews arrived. The airport prepared itself for another morning. And he was still there. Days passed, then weeks. The airport became familiar. He learned where everything was, where the bathrooms were, where he could sit, where he could find food, which employees recognized him. The place that had once been confusing slowly became predictable, and that predictability mattered, because when everything outside your life is uncertain, routine becomes survival. Eventually, his life developed a strange rhythm. Wake up. Wash, eat, read, watch. Passengers leave. Watch passengers arrive. Sleep. And repeat. Every day, thousands of people were beginning journeys. He was not. They had destinations. He had a bench. Imagine seeing the same stranger every time you passed through an airport. Travelers began to notice him. Some wondered who he was. Some felt sorry for him. Some simply accepted him as part of the airport. And airport workers became familiar with his presence. To most passengers, he was temporary. But to the people working there every day, he was becoming a permanent fixture. Then something happened that is difficult to understand from the outside. Time stopped feeling temporary. 5 years passed. The man who had once been waiting to leave had now spent years inside the terminal. Around him, the world was changing. New passengers, new advertisements, new airplanes, new technology. But his position remained almost exactly the same. But there was something unusual about Nasseri's story. This was not simply a man physically locked inside an airport. His legal situation changed over time. He was eventually offered legal routes that could have allowed him to leave. Yet the story did not end there. Nasseri remained. The reasons became increasingly complicated. His identity, his documents, and his own understanding of who he was all became intertwined with the airport itself. Eventually, his story could no longer remain inside the airport. Journalists discovered him. Photographers arrived. His unusual existence became international news. Suddenly, the quiet man sitting beside his luggage was no longer anonymous. People around the world were asking the same question. How can a human being live inside an airport for years? Nasseri began calling himself Sir Alfred. His story became so unusual that people began treating him almost like a local celebrity. Yet underneath the strange publicity was something much darker. A man had spent years without a conventional home. No front door, no neighborhood, no private room, no ordinary morning. His entire existence was happening in public. 10 years, think about that. 10 years of watching other people leave. Children who once walked through the terminal returned as teenagers. Young travelers became parents. Airport employees grew older. Technology transformed around him. But Nasseri remained. The world was moving forward. His life was standing still. By the early 2000s, Nasseri's story had become famous enough to inspire a Hollywood movie. In 2004, Steven Spielberg released The Terminal, starring Tom Hanks. The film was fictional. Its protagonist was not Nasseri. But the extraordinary premise came from the real man's experience. Hollywood had turned his impossible life into entertainment. But the real story was stranger than the movie. After nearly 18 years, Nasseri finally left the airport in 2006. He had spent most of his adult life inside a place designed for people who were supposed to leave. But leaving did not suddenly make everything normal. The airport had become more than a location. It had become his routine, his identity, his world. Imagine finally receiving the freedom you had waited years for and discovering that freedom itself feels unfamiliar. Outside the terminal, Paris continued without him. Cars moved. People hurried. Buildings stood where they had always stood. The world had not stopped. Only his life had. For the next years, his life continued away from the terminal. But the airport remained the place most closely associated with him. The place where he had spent 18 years. The place where the world had discovered him. And eventually, the place he would return to. In 2022, Nasseri returned to Charles de Gaulle Airport, the same kind of place where his extraordinary story had begun decades earlier. He was no longer the young man who had arrived in Europe. He was 77 years old, and once again, he was inside an airport. On November 12, 2022, Mehran Karimi Nasseri died inside Charles de Gaulle Airport. The airport that had once been a temporary waiting place had followed him through nearly his entire adult life. He was 77 years old. He died in the same environment that had defined the strangest chapter of his life. A terminal full of people arriving, a terminal full of people leaving, and one man whose journey had finally ended. But perhaps the strangest part of Nasseri's story isn't that he lived in an airport for 18 years. It's what happened after he was finally free to leave. Because by then, the airport was no longer simply the place where he had been trapped. It was the place he understood, the place where people knew him, the place where he had built a routine, the place that had witnessed his entire transformation from a young traveler into an old man. Every person walking through that terminal had somewhere to go, a vacation, a business trip, a new home, a reunion, a goodbye. Nasseri had something different. He had a place, but he never really had a destination. Mehran Karimi Nasseri's story is often told as the story of a man trapped in an airport. 18 years is a long time, long enough for a temporary place to become permanent, long enough for strangers to become familiar faces, long enough for a waiting room to become a home. For most people, an airport is a place between two destinations. For Mehran Karimi Nasseri, the airport became the destination itself.